Thy brother's blood. RK equals. Part 6. RK equals. Loyalist positions. Senate building. Coruscant. A torrent spun out of the sky with its right wing gone and splattered itself nearby, throwing burning chunks of fuselage over the tense standoff. More rogue clones moved around the obstruction despite an ever-increasing loyalist close air support. Look, what the Chancellor and General Kenobi did. They did it for the good of the Republic. Anakin struggled to find the right words. He didn't know these clones, he hadn't fought beside them since the war began. Rex, if the man was in any mood to listen to anything Anakin would ever have to say, him he knew how to speak to. He knew that man. These? Trying to convince them what was best for them was obviously out of the question, if that was ever a consideration in the first place. They did attack the Senate, a place they had to know would be defended by an overwhelming number of loyalists. What was left then? They were obviously far too willing to shoot their own brothers, disturbingly so in fact, something Skywalker shelved for a later consideration. What he was left with was their obvious faith in the Republic. They fought to preserve it, didn't they? He had to put stopping this madness in a way that would resonate with their desire to protect it. Sith spit, he should have paid more attention to Obi-Wan's lessons about diplomacy and how to properly talk to people, instead of blanking out most of those conversations while thinking about tinkering with the latest thing that got his fancy. "It's what we're doing," snapped the clone on point, rudely interrupting his internal monologue. "If your bastards had any regards about what's best for the Republic, you wouldn't have needed a coup. If you had enough support, your so-called Chancellor wouldn't have needed to sideline the Senate. We all know she can't have enough support, otherwise none of this would be necessary. We won't leave you people to convince, coerce or buy your way into legitimacy. We're sworn to protect the Republic and the Senate, not to silently support and uphold a coup. We won't betray our duty." That's not what happened. Anakin protested in a tone that betrayed the fact he believed it to be at least partially true. Probably because as far as he knew, it was. Despite the cacophony of the ongoing battle, his voice carried out loud enough to be heard and he immediately blamed himself for that slip of the tongue. The distinct drone of an approaching LART sounded from behind. Anakin didn't need to look back to see incoming reinforcements, however he couldn't help but curse their timing. If he hadn't slipped, if he had more time to talk. "He's buying time," a clone shouted. There was no need for any more words. As one, the rebels opened fire and Anakin was hard-pressed to weather the onslaught. He dove deeply in the Force and let it guide his movements. His body moved on autopilot, a mix by his powers, guidance and years of training, which let his mind freer to think. He had to end this, before that walker came into action. There were injured people laying all around him and heavy ordnance impacting where he stood would be fatal. It was bad enough that there was too much incoming fire that he couldn't properly deflect the shots back and had to simply interpose his blade between him and them as fast as possible. At least the walker's turret was swinging away, probably to take out the LART behind. He was out of time. Anakin snapped his prosthetic arm forward in a gesture that helped his mind channel the Force in a massive push that carried a telekinetic wave half a meter above the ground, thus missing the injured. As suddenly as it began, the onslaught halted as every single rebel shooting at him was thrown off their fleet. He wasted no time and charged the walker, even though it was futile. A pair of missiles streaked overhead just as the Force sent him a warning and he dove for the ground. The walker managed to send a single shot downrange before the warheads struck. One blew the vulnerable cockpit to pieces while the other slammed just below the turret and detonated, tearing it from its cradle. A split second later the LART behind exploded when the enemy's round flew true and the walker followed suit when ammo and fuel cooked off. Shock waves slammed into Anakin and the wounded, bringing their little part of the engagement into a fiery end. Equals. Senate building. Coruscant. Her whole world was a loud buzzing sound and dull, all-encompassing pain. Something hard and firm laid over her, pressing her uncomfortably in the floor, making her hurt even more. The weight shifted and she let out a moan of pain and relief. Red emergency light came online and revealed a blurry white form leaning above her. "RGHT. Chancellor, are you all right?" The armored man shouted louder and this time she made out the words over the echoing ringing in her ears. "DHT, NHW. Her jaw ached something fierce and only mumble got out. "Get me a medic over here," the figure ordered. Now she could hear pieces of other conversations too. "Perimeters breached. The whole left flank's as good as gone. While the traps closed and we've got reinforcements pouring in, a number of enemy transports got to the building before our fighters could lock down the airspace. Wounded all over the building. Multiple checkpoints not responding. Enemy infantry confirmed in sectors. The Senate chamber got hit hard. We've got significant losses there, including multiple senators. The primary is priority 1. Funnel all available reinforcements to our position. We're bunkering here if practical, then retaking the rest of the building. Any word on the general? The armored form turned his head sideways when he asked someone Satine couldn't see. What the hell did just happen? Why did everything hurt? Her mind was slowly rebooting and piecing things together from the bits of conversations she could comprehend. They were at the Senate waiting for something. An attack? What? Unknown at this time, sir. His unit was much closer to the impact site. We've lost contact. Any units still active nearby are moving in to extract him if practical. The general? That was wrong. The clones usually talked about only one man that way, and he was out on the rim doing Sith things and generally making her life harder. Who then? Obi-Wan. Satine managed to croak and tried to stand up, only to be held back by firm hands. Stay down, Mom. At least until the medic clears you up. We got just a moment of warning before we got hit. The armored figure came into focus as Satine glared at it. Now she could give it a proper name, Commander Cody, the minder Obi-Wan put in charge of her security. What happened? Her voice shook, but she could speak even if it sent sharp needles of pain up and down her jaw. She felt as if someone slugged her, while wearing an armored gauntlet no less. She should know, Satine had an experience with that courtesy of Bo during their first fallout years ago. The building got hit by a very light ship-grade ordnance, Mom. We're only lucky it wasn't something heavier or we wouldn't have this conversation. Cody trailed off. She knew the implications. Anything heavier would have gutted the whole building and killed everyone inside and nearby for that matter. The actual heavy stuff. Satine didn't want to think about the collateral damage. There was a reason why ships usually didn't slug it in the atmosphere. The side effects tended to be catastrophic if they went all out. Like those reports from the time of the Jedi coup from Corellia. But that was a problem for later. It's bad, I take it? Satine asked, while pointedly ignoring a medic who came over and began waving a scanner over her. Bad. That strike practically wiped out the division, caught directly in the way of its backblast and decimated those on the flanks, leaving a huge gap in our perimeter. Enemy units get inside before our reinforcements could stop them. They'll be going after you and the senators, Ma'am Chancellor. Orders about their disposition? It took Satine long seconds to figure out what exactly was Cody asking. Then she took a double take, in disbelief. Was she wrong after her association with Vale, or did the man politely ask for permission to arrange an accident for the surviving senators? Perhaps she was overreacting and he simply meant if he should send more people to keep them out of the hands of the rebels. She hoped so at least. Do your best to prevent their capture by rogue forces. Mom, I'm not detecting anything life-threatening for you, however the shock has your baby in distress. I'm recommending displacing you to a proper hospital ASAP just to be on the safe side. The medic interrupted. All color drained from Satine's face. In the chaos and excitement after becoming Chancellor, not to mention when the crisis with the clones began, she utterly forgot about the fact she was pregnant and how everything could affect her baby. Does she need to be moved now? Cody asked. We can't guarantee her security if we displace immediately. Nothing critical, I think, but try to keep them both from getting shacked around again. I'm not really versed in this. The medic, presumably another clone under that armor, shrugged. We will do so ASAP, then. Where are my bloody reinforcements? Cody stood up and went to order his minions around. RK equals. Part 7. RK equals. Senate Building. Coruscant. Sheev Palpatine, the now former Chancellor of the Galactic Republic, also known as Darth Sidious, the Dark Lord of the Sith. That was his name, who he was. He could remember it all now. It all got back in bits and pieces while he watched the battle, which was turning to be surprisingly fun. With the regained knowledge came self-reflection. Sheev couldn't help but wonder which of his contingencies in case of a sudden and unexpected death led to this nice little bit of chaos. It was a bit concerning that apparently there was a snag with Order 66, Skywalker fighting alongside one of the two sides, without said clones shooting him in the back indicated that much. Still, This nice little civil war going on was a point indicating that at least some contingencies did work after all. He walked across the halls of the Senate and enjoyed the show, while pondering what to do, now that he was dead by apparently not quite. What could he do besides pass through walls and play voyeur? That wasn't a pastime he was going to enjoy, that much Palpatine knew. A whole clone platoon ran from behind and passed through him as if he wasn't even there. Despite that happening a lot since he came back, the feeling was still weird. Being ignored that way, there was no way to put it mildly, it grated, damn it all. At least the defensive platoon wasn't going to bother anyone for much longer. There were the delightful sounds of battle and general mayhem coming behind the corner, and when Palpatine walked around it he was graced with a pleasing sight. The irritating group of clones had run straight into a barricade manned by more of their kind and were now busy annihilating each other. Blaster rifles, man-portable assault weapons and grenade launchers spat fire in all directions. Explosions scoured the metal walls of the corridor, blaster bolts tore chunks of the alloy, yet the short and vicious battle wasn't over in the instant as one might expect. Despite finding themselves in the open with not a shred of cover, the attackers weren't exactly helpless. Their improved armor and its built-in shields made what should have been a suicidal charge in a much less one-sided affair. A burst from a grenade launcher tore the barricade apart along with the fire team manning it, but before that could happen, the leading element of the platoon was cut down by concentrated heavy weapons fire. The rest fared little better, because it was soon revealed that behind the first barricade waited another, with yet more clones and heavier weapons. More grenades flew both ways and somehow didn't run afoul by the automatic blaster fire filling the corridor. Deafening explosions followed and red-hot shrapnel scythed its way into armor that mostly held at anything but point-blank range, where the shockwave itself was the real danger. An assault cannon shredded the next barricade along with two of the clones taking cover there, then a rocket blew up the heavy trooper and a pair of his own buddies. Then thermal detonator thrown by the defenders put an end of the skirmish by searing the far end of the corridor with its short-lived nuclear fury, and it was all over. Palpatine walked over red-hot warped floor and through melting wreckage that used to be armored men. Oh, how he missed the few occasions he got to cut loose in such a way himself. It's been years since he could be himself instead of playing the nice old man. It was so frustrating, and now that this battle rubbed it in his face he had to wonder, was it worth it? For a decade he was the most powerful man in the galaxy, yet he didn't get to have any fun. It was just dealing with one crisis after another or butting heads with the idiots in the Senate so anything could get done. Neither he nor the Sith in general couldn't even take credit for that particular mess. The senators and their masters at home ensured that the Senate was the dysfunctional mess that it was when he was elected for the first time. It was the height of irony that the Republic functioned the best it had in centuries, if not since the Reformation, under the guide of a Sith intending to turn it into his personal empire. At least once that was done he was supposed to finally have some fun, right? Thinking about the Senate and the fact that he would have had to deal with them for years to come, and that was the best-case scenario. Why did he really bother? Vengeance against those stuck-up hermits in the Jedi Temple. Well, over the years they did cause him much fewer problems than the Senate. In fact, they were usually at least as helpful as a pain in the backside. Only now that he was dead it looked like he saw things more or less clearly. There had been something inherently flawed in the Sith's grand plan. It had to be when even a complete success meant only more thankless toil for years to come after he dedicated his life to it. Now that he thought about it, it didn't seem worth it. Not really, because what becoming an emperor would really gain him. He was painfully aware of all the alliances, deals and promises he had to make in order to ensure that his empire won't be stillborn. That also meant he would have been bound to follow up on most of those promises and would have had his hands full in ensuring he didn't lose everything until his new order got established as the status quo. It would take even more time to get enough people believing that the empire would be the best way forward for them if no one else. Barring a miracle, it would be another decade, probably 2 to 3, before he could rid himself of the Senate and begin to enjoy the spoils of his victory. Would he ever had time to figure out Plague's intended way to become immortal? Palpatine walked through another long corridor, one leading towards the Senate chamber. Something in the Force told him that there would be something interesting to see there. What he did saw after entering was another battle. He had been so self-absorbed he hadn't even paid heed to the sound, though to be fair, the whole building echoed with rapid fire and explosions. At any other time, such absent-mindedness would have been inexcusable. Today? He was already very, very dead, so what of it? This time, the attackers won the day, by using a liberal amount of explosives and mowing down everyone who survived the initial bombardment with heavy weapons. One of them attached a square device to the door leading into the chamber, got back to a safe distance and pressed a detonator's button. A blinding bluish explosion obscured the far end of the corridor. Just a few pieces of melted metal flew back. Thought they fell short of the waiting clones, who threw a few grenades in and then charged after the concussion ordnance went off. Palpatine calmly walked inside behind them and grinned at the sight that greeted him. Oh, how many times he had wished to reveal his true colors to the men and women gathered in this place and demonstrate to them the depths of his frustration with their foolishness. What he saw was like a dream come true. Many of the pods were thrown out from their cradles and laid crashed either at the bottom or, more often, at the ones on the rows below. Hundreds were dead, with many more injured spread all over the place, crushed, maimed, or just fallen a row or two below, resulting in nasty breaks. There were a lot of clones inside. Some were attempting to restore order, others were busy treating the wounded, and ensured that their own got preferential treatment. It was in this scene of carnage that the group Palpatine followed charged. Initially no one was in a position to respond, and they managed to cut down a number of the defenders, along with at least a few senators foolish enough to be at the wrong time at the wrong place. Or at the right time and place as Sheev saw it. He just wished that he could actually make this mess even nastier for the band of his past 10 years who were all conveniently gathered in one place. More of the attackers broke in through different entrances and the chaos raised up a notch. The senators predictably lost it and tried to run for the nearest exit. At places the clones either let them go or were in no position to stop them. In others, they either bodily checked the running people or leveled weapons at them. Now all it would take was just a little push and Palpatine's day would be complete. It was then when a group of bolder senators, or just more arrogant or even scared from the battle, pushed their luck. Sheev didn't know what order the clones had, but it suddenly ceased to matter. One of them clubbed a particularly insistent human across the face with the stock of his weapon. Another senator grabbed the weapon and grappled with the clone, which prompted the rest of that small group to rush the soldiers. Palpatine narrowed his eyes at the scene, then they lit up in recognition. That little clique was made of veterans from various security services. It was unlikely that they would just stand down and let such an opportunity to go to waste. Something told him that the senators weren't gathered here by their own volition. The way the clones were trying to keep them inside despite the ongoing attack on the chamber indicated that much. Figuring out that would be quite interesting, once he was done watching the show. In the middle of the grappling a blaster went off and it was too close to a clone for his armor's shields to activate. The shot caught him in the neck and he went down immediately. For a single stunned instant the struggling paused, then the clones' buddies ceased playing nice and leveled down their weapons. Another heartbeat and they opened fire at the senators they could hit without risking hitting their fellow soldiers. Seeing that, the rest of the senators went wild and Palpatine laughed to his heart's content. Thy brother's blood equals RK equals. Phase 8 equals RK equals. Senate building. Coruscant. Black smoke billowed through the corridors in the damaged part of the building. Emergency lights and blaster fire burned through it, casting everything in a sinister twilight. Even explosions were of little reprieve, because what little smoke got cleared by the blast waves was soon replaced by more of the stuff coming from the burning part of the Senate. In the middle of that slice of hell, Obi-Wan figured the hard way that his preferred Soul-Risu was somewhat less effective against men with shielded armor. While his blade work was back up to excellence now that he was fully recovered from his injuries, the shots he reflected against the various groups of rebels he encountered merely splashed harmlessly over their deflectors. That simple fact forced him to either go in and deal with them close and personal or rely on the Force more than he was accustomed to. Their armor, identical to his own, while very nice, was still vulnerable to good old-fashioned blunt impact. Telekinetically slamming clones into the walls and even sealing accounted for more neutralized rebels than he dispatched using his lightsaber. The shields were marginally effective there too, making it at least theoretically possible to survive a fast slash, which meant he had to deliver stronger, if somewhat slower strikes that kept his lightsaber blade in contact with his target for a bit longer than usual. If he didn't have shielded armor too, doing so could have proved fatal. Despite that, the blasters weren't the real threat. Heavy repeaters or even assault cannons carried by heavy troopers and the occasional grenade launcher were more of a threat, though he could handle them with the aid of his telekinesis and uncanny perception granted by the Force. Without the gifts of his power, Obi-Wan knew he would have fallen already. Even with it, he was shaken from the after effects of whatever hit the building. He found it harder and harder to keep his mind focused thanks to a pounding headache, and that meant his fine control of the force soon began to suffer. There was a delay between noticing a threat and being able to do something about it. It was almost unnoticeable in the start. A shot slipped through his guard when it shouldn't have while he was busy dispatching another fire team. Nevertheless, his shield tanked the hit and he cut the clones to pieces, barely slowing down. The next group proved more troublesome. There was a heavy trooper handling an assault cannon as if it was toy in the hands of his heavy exoskeleton augmented armor. Obi-Wan hadn't seen that particular modification of the armor before, nor did he had time or the desire to examine it when the man leveled that awfully big weapon at him. Kenobi grabbed the clone in a telekinetic grip and slammed him in the ceiling, once, twice, then for a good measure a third time. Meanwhile, he was deflecting everything the rest of the squad could throw at him and his concentration broke. A shot slipped through, then another. His deflector flared with reflected and absorbed energy, until a third and fourth blaster bolt slammed through his guard and the defensive field fizzled into a cooldown cycle. At least by then the heavy trooper was knocked out and Obi-Wan used him to sweep through half the squad before he had to drop him and concentrate all his remaining attention on deflecting the raining shots. Two more slipped through anyway, however they fortunately slammed into the thick chest plate of his armor, which had its upper layers ablate. The lower one spread the heat, preventing a nasty burn, and thankfully that was it. All he really experienced was 2 impacts, enough to stagger him and increase of heat. Now that Obi-Wan could concentrate all his attention on blocking, he was able to push through the distracting headache and didn't let anything more slip before his deflector came back online. At that point he slammed a telekinetic push into the clones, including those who were just getting up, and jumped in the middle of them. A flurry of blows and another telekinetic push saw that engagement over, and it was just in time. He really had to take a moment to catch up his breath. Now there was a spell of dizziness coming along with the headache. A concussion then? That sounded legit considering what happened to the people with him when the Senate was hit. It was really a miracle that he was as well as he was. "General?" a clone shouted from behind. "What?" He didn't sense anyone approach. Obi-Wan's eyes widened and he whirled around as fast as force-enhanced reflexes could make him. That sudden motion was one push too many and he found himself stumbling to his knees. Fortunately, those clones were friendly. "Sir, are you all right?" a sergeant asked. "I'll live," Obi-Wan groaned. "Status report?" "My comms are out. We're to reinforce the Chancellor's positions as a priority, then secure the senators and sweep the building for hostiles. The battle outside is wrapping up. We've got reinforcements on the ground and complete air dominance. It's just those who got inside when they blasted through the perimeter we have to worry about." "Good enough, I guess. You're with me. We're passing through the Senate chamber to check on what's happening there and then linking with the Chancellor's security detail. Take point." Obi-Wan fought through the dizziness to speak clearly. Perhaps he hadn't recovered as well as he thought, or the shock wave of the explosion got him worse than he was aware. "Perhaps a medic should check up on you, sir?" "That," Obi-Wan winced, "might be for the best, Sergeant." "Get me a perimeter." "Doc, check up the general." =RK equals Senate Chamber, Senate Building, Coruscant. A few minutes later, Obi-Wan entered the chamber accompanied by a platoon's worth of soldiers he had linked up on the way there. The medic confirmed he had a nasty concussion and it was clear to him that it was only because of the force he could operate as well as he was so far, but he needed a bit of downtime. A shot of stimulant cleared his mind a bit, but that was only a very short-term solution. Inside, a scene of pure madness greeted him. All over the place groups of clones were shooting at each other while senators were either running for the exits or hugging whatever cover they could find. In places there were soldiers trying to keep them inside, and in others he could clearly see where groups of the elected officials were gunned down when they attempted to flee. And all that was on top of the whole chamber becoming a complete mess, with at least couple of hundred pods fallen from their cradles with predictable results. "Orders?" Sergeant Young asked after signing to the soldiers to take defensive positions. Kenobi's party had emerged near the top of the chamber, which not only gave them a great vantage point to the unfolding chaos but ensured that no one immediately noticed their entrance. "Figure out who is friendly and support them, then find a way to stop this madness." Dangerous anger sparkled at the sight of the unfolding mayhem. When he gathered the senators here, to keep them better safe until the unpleasantries were over and as a bait, he was ready to admit that much, this certainly hadn't been what he intended. If he was crazy enough to want most of them dead and actually act upon it, he hoped that at least he would have the guts to do the act himself instead of arranging something like this. Words failed him. Obi-Wan took a step forward, then another and another until he stood in a pod that was still firmly held in its cradle. He opened himself fully to the Force and let her enhance his voice. "This is General Kenobi. Stand down. There has been enough killing today." His voice carried through the chamber like a distant thunder that swept away the deafening sounds of combat. Everyone froze and looked up in his direction. "Enough, I say," Obi-Wan repeated even louder, then got shot for his trouble. Below, the fighting resumed with a renewed ferocity. The Loyalists were enraged at the sneak attack, and the rebels infuriated by what they saw as an attempt to influence their minds. "Sergeant, take out the rebels. This ends now. And call all the medics we can spare," Obi-Wan ordered in a frustrated voice. He raised a hand, using it to more easily focus his mind on what he was doing, and telekinetically picked up a nearby pod. He took a moment to make sure his concentration won't fail him, then another to aim and hurled it at a group of rebels who didn't have any senators around or below them. The attack blindsided them and crushed a whole fire team. The rest of that squad scattered and fell easy prey to a Loyalist unit that was engaging them. He was able to repeat that feat twice more before running out of safe targets, and only then did he jump down toward the closest group of enemies that Sergeant Young's soldiers weren't busy engaging. One way or another, he was going to end this insanity. =RK= Part 9. =RK= Senate Chamber. Senate Building. Coruscant. The madness actually got worse before an ever-increasing stream of reinforcements could arrive and help put an end to it. With both sides gone berserk, casualties mounted at an insane rate, proving that advanced armor and shielding weren't of much help when those who wore them charged at the enemy heedless of the incoming fire. Later, Obi-Wan would think that he should have taken a better care at what he said to the clones. His people took him at his word and threw themselves at the enemy to end the threat ASAP, no matter the casualties they were going to suffer. The rebels weren't much better. They were furious at how he handled the situation and needed to eke out a win in the chamber before enough reinforcements made it inside so they could rescue as many senators as possible. Using a shock, high-risk high-rewards tactics was what most of them decided to do. The results were predictably bloody. Ironically, the people who paid the highest price were those who both sides wanted to keep safe, for some degree of safety at least. The senators were caught in the middle, often with little to no useful cover, and none of them was armed or armored. Even a close miss could injure or be even fatal. Blown chunks of walls or pods turned into so much deadly shrapnel. Grenades of all types did even better work, and the blasters used by everyone were powerful enough to blow off an appendage from an unarmored being. To make things even worse, certain groups of Loyalist clones took their orders to keep the senators in the chamber very literally, and they didn't feel like being nice about it in the middle of a firefight. At no less than 10 occasions, senators trying to rush an exit were mowed down by blaster fire. It was in the middle of that utter chaos that Obi-Wan figured out that his concussion had to be much worse than they believed, or at least that he didn't handle the stimulant well. After cutting the head off the last clone from a rebel fireteam, he found himself helmet to face with a dead man. Former Chancellor Palpatine stood upon a still intact pod and simply looked at the carnage with an atypical manic smile. There was no mistaking the man, even if he looked like a weird hologram, all glowing and transparent. Yet as far as the Force was concerned, there was a man standing on that platform. Obi-Wan shook his head, which made his headache spike, and vowed to go get that downtime the moment the Senate building was secure and he knew Satine was safe. That would be for the best. Hallucinations were never good. Obi-Wan. Palpatine's apparition turned his way, and his expression softened to something that might have been a genuine smile, if it wasn't for the manic look in the man's eyes. Did they flash yellow for a moment there? Kenobi blinked and the ghost's eyes were back their familiar color. He grumbled, ignored the hallucination, and looked for another group of the rebels. He saw it a few levels below. They were in a nice elevated position, suppressing a platoon's worth of his people. Obi-Wan paused to center himself and regain his concentration after the shock of seeing a hallucination, surrounded himself in a telekinetic sheath and jumped down. He landed behind a clone and slammed his lightsaber in the back of the man's neck. Then it took him precious moments to focus enough to release the energy surrounding him in a useful manner. The rebels were already turning to cut him down when he released a mighty telekinetic wave that sent them all flying out of their position, and the Loyalists proceeded to make a short work of those who survived their landings. The general looked for more enemies, however he was pleasantly surprised to see that the fighting was dying off. There were just 3 remaining rebel positions and they were suppressed and under fire from multiple directions. One after another the rogue clones were shot up until the last few demonstrated a previously lacking amount of common sense and surrendered. The shooting was suddenly over. The chaos on the other hand. Obi-Wan scanned the surrounding area through the Force and sensed no more imminent danger. He removed his helmet and tiredly rubbed his forehead. The cool metallic fingers of his gauntlet soothed a bit his pounding headache, but that was soon remedied when the smell hit him. Melted metal, both from the chamber itself and blasted armor, burning flesh, which thankfully wasn't something you could really get accustomed to. The stench made his stomach turn and it took all his willpower and a Force-related trick not to empty its contents then and there. "Where are those medics?" Obi-Wan's voice carried on over the finally quiet chamber. Well, quieter. While there was no more shooting and explosions, the screams and moans of the wounded almost made up for it. "On their way, sir," Sergeant Young shouted from an upper row. Kenobi looked up and was relieved to see that most of the people who followed him in this mess made it out unscratched. Having the elevated ground and decent cover sure helped their case. The sergeant apparently sensibly kept his people in place and didn't let them charge the enemy as all too many other clone NCOs and officers did. That was another thing he would have to deal sooner than later. What did those fools think doing something that suicidal? Sure, it ended the fight faster but the sheer carnage. "That's a nasty spot of trouble, Obi-Wan. I can call you Obi-Wan now that I'm no longer the Chancellor and we don't have to stand up on formalities, can't I?" Palpatine's ghost asked. Obi-Wan most definitely didn't jump and turn around with his lightsaber raised. He would deny it despite being caught on multiple cameras from clones' helmets, especially as far as those recordings were concerned. He then spoke to a patch of empty space. "You're dead and I have concussion." Obi-Wan nodded to himself. "I think you're right on both counts. I'm pretty sure I'm dead at least and you should know better than me if you have a concussion or not." The apparition spoke reasonably. The voice was a match for Palpatine. "Really bad concussion." Kenobi trailed off and looked over the chamber. The place was a wreck. Clones were moving through the debris and bodies and began triaging the wounded. "Someone with a working comm, find the status of the Chancellor for me. I hope that wife of yours is all right," Palpatine offered. "I'm not talking with a hallucination," Obi-Wan mumbled. Terrified and sometimes angry senators looked at him from their hiding places. Their eyes were haunted, but those coherent enough laid accusing gazes upon his form. They were right at least in part too. This trap had been approved by him even if the initial half-backed plan came from a few members of his staff. He finalized it and made it into something that should have worked. Not this. "General, about the Chancellor." A clone commander approached. "Don't look at me. Now it's your wife who should have all the fun the positioning tail. I'm actually pitying the poor woman." Palpatine shrugged with a weird smile. =RK equals. Private Wing. Manon's Blessing Hospital Complex. Coruscant. For the 3rd time, your daughter is going to be all right, Mom Chancellor. A Bith doctor droned in an exasperated voice. He used a fluent basic, which was a big achievement for someone of his species. Their mouths weren't built for most sounds associated with the language. "I'll recommend that you cut down on the excitement, stress and don't get shot at or blown up again until you give birth." His huge eyes narrowed at Satine who was resting in a large comfortable bed. "I'll make sure that she don't get blown up again," Obi-Wan vowed in a relieved voice. "In that case I'll leave you for now. Do try to behave." The doctor gently chided and left the room. "I'll help," Palpatine's ghost added, earning himself a glare. He kinda followed Obi-Wan once he figured out no one else could see or hear him and that almost got him hospitalized. He was still unsure if he was hallucinating due to the concussion, the medication or if the former Chancellor was really haunting him. On that topic he found it hard to believe the force that indicated that Palpatine was really there. Everything he knew about it pointed at such a thing being impossible, yet it wasn't like he knew everything. There were whole vaults in the Jedi Temple full with records of forbidden knowledge. Or at least there were. During their flights, the Jedi salvaged as many of the extensive libraries and archives as they could and Obi-Wan left strong guard watching over what was left in the building in general to discourage thieves. The Jedi deserved that much if not more, despite the Order's betrayal. "Obi-Wan, you're acting weirdly," Satine concluded after thanking the doctor. "Do you want to tell me something?" Can I get back to you later on that? He hedged. First he had to figure out if it was the concussion, if he went insane, or if he was really haunted by a ghost. So be it. His wife sighed. What a mess. Do you have preliminary number of casualties? What about the clones still holding out all over the Coruscant? Not everyone came to attack the Senate, far from it. About half of the remaining rebels already boarded the rogue elements of the fleet. We've still got a decent army worth of clones dug in at a lot of places, however they aren't going nowhere without our say-so. I'm not really sure how to handle them. Force, I'm not sure they really know what they intend to do either. There has been enough bloodshed, don't you think? Satine asked. We have to end this peacefully if at all possible. I wholeheartedly agree, dear. However, convincing them might be a spot of trouble. Satine giggled. I didn't know you were for such grand understatements. Have you asked them what they want, besides us shot for treason? Well, that's pretty much it, which is the problem in the first place. Have Ahsoka ask again. She's in contract with one of their commanders, isn't she? Satine frowned. She should point out that they still have an open way out, which won't last for much longer. When is the rebel portion of the fleet leaving? Less than 24 hours now. Faster if Yularen has anything to say about it. None of our admirals are thrilled at having those ships hanging above Coruscant. It would take just one of those crews snapping further to make today's bloodshed a footnote in history. After what Grievous do at Mandalore, I can see where they're coming from. I'm not comfortable having potentially hostile force in orbit either. Can't be helped. An actual battle will cause significant collateral damage. That said, our fleet is in position to take them out as fast as possible if the worst happens. What are your orders in case the rebel holdouts don't take a ride on the rogue fleet or surrender, Madam Chancellor? Obi-Wan asked formally. Simply cutting most of them out of supply and waiting for hunger to change their mind isn't an option, is it? Well, that might work, if you don't care about all the civilians lying low in those sectors. Palpatine pipped up. However, as Mandalorians, you have to step even lighter than most or your political enemies would spin this whole mess in even nastier light. Obi-Wan groaned and glanced at the ghost, who looked unrepentant. In fact, the former Chancellor appeared to be enjoying himself. Obi-Wan, are you all right? After today? Not at all. Kenobi admitted. Too many people died because I criffed up, love. Satine. I almost lost you and the baby, he whispered. You didn't. It's going to be all right, Obi-Wan. It's not like I plan to get into another firefight. We'll leave them to Bo from now on. Satine smiled mischievously. She'll be pissed off she missed all the excitement stuck in the embassy still recovering. I'm just afraid that she would go out to make up for lost time once she's up and about. Either that or head for the Rim looking for her husband. After today, you two are going to get painted with the same brush, you know. Palpatine sounded all too pleased at himself at that declaration. So much in fact that Obi-Wan's head snapped up to stare at his ghostly visage. I think I'll have that explanation right now, husband, Satine declared crossly. You aren't all right. How was he supposed to explain this? RK equals. Part 10. RK equals. Zone B60. Gresh Sector. Coruscant. For hours now, Ahsoka gnarled on her bottom lip in a behavior unbecoming a Jedi, much less an officer in the GAR. Ever since she learned about the plan TM from Obi-Wan, she had been second-guessing herself more and more as the time for that trap to spring got near. When the battle at the Senate building erupted, she was already fit to be tied. Her friends and family were there, she should be there instead stuck glaring daggers at the dug-in positions of a bunch of rogue clones. As progress of the battle trickled down the chain of command, her anxiety grew to never previously seen levels, as did her second-guessing. Could acting earlier have made a difference, besides getting a lot of people killed? If she had ordered an attack and removed the dug-in rebels, she might have been able to be at the Senate. Or not. Ahsoka might have been ordered to look after another group of the rogues or too busy consolidating her unit and policing the area after securing it. This wasn't the kind of what-ifs a life as a Padawan prepared her for. Before things were simple, talking about it and waiting was the obvious good and only reasonable choice she could have made. Talking was always preferable to shooting and fighting after all, if you were a Jedi that is. As a regimental commander on the other hand, things weren't so simple and clear-cut. Her actions decided if thousands of people would live or die, and she knew that there would be times when even if she did everything right, there would be a lot of dying. That wasn't what a Jedi should think, much less believe. Yet, as an officer who already had an experience with this war, she knew it to be a painful, inevitable truth. When Ahsoka heard about someone blowing up a significant part of the Senate, her command staff looked ready to bodily check her if she tried to bolt to check up what the hell was happening in person. It was a close thing too, because she was damn tempted to do so anyway. Her frustration grew along, and even the simple fact that the rogues they were keeping an eye on were uncommonly quiet while the drama at the Senate unfolded was enough to worsen her fraying temper. What was wrong with those clones? Why couldn't they make up their minds? Their brothers were either evacuating or too busy killing and dying at the Senate, but not the ones she was stuck with. They were apparently content with just digging in as if there was no tomorrow and waiting. Give me another perimeter sweep, sensors, drones and patrols. Make sure we aren't being fooled and our friends haven't just left a screening force while somehow evading us, Ahsoka ordered. I'll handle it, sir. Her XO, once again, was his efficient self. It probably came from his years as a manager of a delivery chain handling logistics back home on an Axis. While green, her regiment did work as a well-oiled machine on. Ahsoka didn't see that changing until they got their first taste of combat. Until then, that left her in the unfamiliar position of having too much free time on her hands to decide what she and her people should do next, while her subordinates handled the lower-level stuff, as it was meant to be. Unfortunately, lately that merely meant she had more time to worry about everything and everyone. When time for actual combat came, Ahsoka believed she might actually face it with relief. Soon enough report came that the Senate's perimeter was secure and the rebels there were either dead or surrendering, mostly dead though. In the building itself, more and more reinforcements were getting in and sweeping it. It was only 2 endless hours later, with nothing of real note, that news from Obi-Wan came in the form of a comm call. The perimeter sweeps revealed nothing new, and as far as she and her people could figure out, their rogue counterparts were indeed locked in their little sector, just lying low. Ahsoka, you're a sight for sore eyes. Obi-Wan looked haggard. His bloodshot eyes had a 1,000-yard stare and he appeared exhausted but at least physically in one piece. Obi-Wan, are you all right? What about Satine or Sky Guy? The moment she saw him, Ahsoka threw away all the military protocol hammered in her head at an Axis, which said a lot considering that her instructors did a great job of it. We're all fine, don't worry, Kenobi sighed. Unfortunately, this isn't a social call, Ahsoka. His bearing shifted and his persona suddenly screamed superior officer. That was enough to make Ahsoka straighten up and salute. Me and my men are at your disposal, General. Colonel Tano, your orders are as follows. You're to make contact with the rebels you're bottling in and impress on them that their continued presence on Coruscant is unacceptable. The rogue elements of the fleet are leaving in 15 hours and any rebel not on them when they do will be dealt with in a short order. I'll deliver the ultimatum, sir. What are my orders if they don't leave or surrender? Prepare to contain a breakout attempt, otherwise hold your positions. We'll hash out the details, but if it comes down to it we'll have to take them out by force. If it comes to that you'll have further reinforcements at your disposal. We'll be dropping an acclamator above their heads to make the point if we have to. Understood, General Kenobi. Good. Do try to persuade them that there is no reason for any more people to die today. Kenobi, out. Relief flooded her and she slumped over the table where a map of the area was projected. They were all right, yay. Now how in the name of the Force was she supposed to convince that hard-headed clone commander to see reason? She's been trying to do precisely that for days now. Any new ideas on how to make that idiot finally see sense? She asked. Her staff looked uneasy at each other. At the start they did have ideas and none of them panned out, which was a bit disheartening. =RK=. An hour later Ahsoka was at the same platform where she met her counterpart every day ever since she arrived at this place. The place hadn't changed and she was pretty sure both sides had the same people covering their commanders in a case of treachery. Commander Office. Ahsoka greeted cordially. Colonel. The clone grumbled. Your friend's bid to take the Senate and kill the Chancellor failed. All they managed to achieve was to kill a lot of good people, including a lot of senators they were trying to rescue. She succinctly explained the situation. What of it? The man continued to be obstinate. By now she was pretty sure he was trolling her. The elements of the fleet friendly to your cause will leave no later than 14 hours from now. I would recommend you take their offer for a ride off-world," she continued calmly. "We're feeling all right in here, Colonel." "That wasn't a suggestion, Commander. Your position is untenable. I've received orders from General Kenobi to offer you an ultimatum. When the fleet breaks orbit, you will either be on board or surrender. When your friends assaulted the Senate, killing his wife was their primary objective." Here Ahsoka let her simmering anger show in her voice. "Both the General and myself are done playing games and tolerating your little temper tantrum, Commander Orphis. However, General Kenobi is a benevolent man. He is giving you one last chance to leave peacefully and thus spare the lives of your men. If you don't take up his offer, we will reduce your position and we won't play nice." "Big words, Colonel. Your men are greener than mine, have much less training, and we had long enough to turn this whole area in one giant death trap," Orphis boasted. "I did mention we wouldn't be playing nice, didn't I? How would your strong points fare under orbital fire? If we have to, we can peel off this whole area level by level until we hit bedrock. It would take a bit of time, but we won't have to actually assault the place on foot, you know. There are a lot of civilians in the perimeter," Orphis pointed out. "Are you going to hide behind them? You claim to fight for the Republic, don't you? Then how can you use Republic citizens as living shields?" Ahsoka asked reasonably. "I can ask the same of you. How can you stand over there and so calmly discuss dismantling this whole sector with orbital fire?" There was an edge of uncertainty in Orphis' voice. "One of my mentors is General Vale. Besides, a ground attack on your sector would kill most of those civilians anyway when they're caught in the crossfire. Need I say more?" Ahsoka bluffed. "Bloody Jedi," Orphis spat. "We're done playing nice. I shouldn't have to repeat myself for a third time. What would it be, Commander? The clock is ticking. Less than 14 hours now and counting. If you relent on the jamming, we'll contact the fleet for extraction, damn you." The long way home. =RK equals. Part 1. =RK equals. Officer quarters. Iriadu Cruiser Peerless. Iriadu. We sat around a small table sharing a bottle of well-aged Corellian brandy, the good stuff. It went down smoothly and the taste was simply sublime. To my left, Joanna drained cup after cup, still morose over the loss of her beloved freedom. She radiated misery as if it was going out of fashion now that there was no immediate danger to distract her. I really had to do something nice about her. Perhaps see if I can swing a nice new Corellian cruiser for her. Thought that was a tall order considering that her home was in separatist hands. Persuading the Quati to give her command of one of their own star dreadnoughts might be a tiny bit easier, which wasn't saying much. My own people, well, we would need to kick out the separatists off Mandalore before we could begin building a proper war machine that can take on all comers. That was in fact one of the reasons why I went with Tarkin the Edler's insane scheme in the Midrim. While hanging out here was problematic in the short term for a lot of obvious reasons, the political support, not to mention a nice alternative to core supplied trade, and more importantly, everything industrial, we would need to turn the whole sector into an economic and industrial powerhouse able to support a vast state-of-the-art military, were kind of vital for my future plans. It would be years at best before we could even think about building something like the Freedom, and even then we would have to find the capital to import a lot of the know-how. I took another sip of my drink and brushed through the dark side, burying my pangs of conscience and regret deeper than usual. I've been doing a lot of that lately, usually subconsciously, ever since Camino. The dark side allowed me to think about and act in ways that went contrary to my morals and beliefs if doing such was useful. The downside was that after doing so, I had to keep my conscience firmly buried behind the veil of my power, and she was only too eager to help. The drawback was obvious. It made it easier to not care about things that most other people found important, like the impact wrecking a gas giant's planetary system might have on the civilians in the Republic who heard about it. Oh, it was military sound. We didn't have the time and resources to do the same in a more conventional manner, which incidentally would have allowed more of the workers stationed there to get away, which wouldn't have been exactly a good thing. Still, it wasn't until I had time to sit down and think until I figured out why exactly people back here on Iriadu were peeved at our actions at Sullust, even when they more or less accepted that we went only after legitimate targets such as military, industry and economy in general. Despite everything that had happened so far, The average person on the street still had trouble wrapping their heads around the fact that there was a real galaxy war going on and how that might mean one of those days some dastardly admiral might show and decided it was a good idea to vaporize them and everything they held dear. The people running things around here were just a tiny bit more accepting of that reality after the siege of Eriadu we interrupted the first time we got here, though some of them still found what it would take to end this conflict distasteful. That in part explained why Gideon was deep in his cups too. During the last battle we got uncomfortable close to being criffed up in a way we most certainly wouldn't have enjoyed, and with us Eriadu too. We should have kept more of the lightly to moderately damaged ships here until some of those being fixed up came back. Tarkin not quite slurred. Hindsight is a beautiful and insidious thing, my friend. I tried to soothe him. They must have stripped everything they had in the nearby sectors to gather that many ships, especially if what we believe is happening at Naboo is true. We should be heading there soon, Joanna pointed out. Not before Eriadu's reinforced, you ain't, Gideon spat. We aren't leaving for a few days at least. By then some more of the damaged ships we left behind at Gerantham should be fixed and won their way here. The same goes for at least a part of the damaged ships from Kamino. Their presence should help secure Eriadu. I paused. Should I? Nah. He knew as well as I did that anything else the Sis would send here would be strong enough to blast through anything we could fix and get operational before the next round of construction was complete, and that was about a year away. 2 to 3 days to fix battle damage, replenish supplies and give the crews a bit of much-needed rest after Sullust and the battle here. Then we have to go to Naboo and dissuade the Separatists from messing up with the Mid-Rim Alliance for the time being. Gideon gave me a disgusted, bleary-eyed look. I blame you and Wilhuff for this whole mess. The three of us know what will happen if this scheme of his doesn't pan out. We're buggered long and hard, Joanna mumbled and laid her head on the table. What she said. I nodded. I hate you all so much, Gideon hissed and drained his cup. Aren't we supposed to be making an R for our political lords and masters? Joanna's face lit up with a look of comprehension. That's the official reason you gave everyone before you dragged us here to get drunk. I nodded at Tarkin. Not drunk enough yet, Gideon stated morosely. All those ships, gone. And here I was thinking that the last time was bad enough. That's the case of war we're fighting. Everyone could recoup their losses fast enough to make most tactical victories of little consequence. Even losing whole systems is usually just a minor setback that gets addressed in another sector. I've seen it before. It was one of the reasons why the Cold War between the Old Republic and the Empire lasted for so long. Both sides were too evenly matched after the initial Imperial Blitz that there was no end in sight of the grinding stalemate if hostilities recommenced for good. After the fall of Corellia, the situation here was similar, with the added bonus of neither side trusting the other to even negotiate a temporary ceasefire. That by itself was amazing clusterfuck in itself when you thought about it. We really didn't know what we got ourselves into, did we? Joanna lifted her head to finish her cup and pour herself another one. I'm certain that the records were there, just no one actually believed that the sides were going to be evenly matched. From all I gather, one way or another it was meant to be a short victorious war. I laughed mirthlessly at that thought. What was the last time such an idea didn't backfire? I can see that. Gideon nodded morosely. Until the clones came, the Republic didn't have an army. The local governments wouldn't have fought to keep the Separatists as a part of the Republic by themselves. After that, well... He shrugged, picked up his glass and glared at it when he remembered it was empty. Joanna suddenly declared. Focus, before we're totally smashed. I think it might be for the better that we spin it as an amazing victory against impossible odds. I offered. Just let's keep it plausible considering all the sensor logs. We did survive against nasty odds, Gideon pointed out. I noticed, thank you very much. I groused. You would. The Seppies threw everything they had at your ship the moment they figured out where you were? She smiled brightly. At least this time I wasn't on board for all that excitement. Yep. She still hadn't forgiven me about the freedom, especially when it dawned to her that the primary reasons the Separatists wanted to take her out wasn't because she was a magnificent and awesomely powerful ship, which she most certainly was, but because I was on board. There's propaganda to consider and how to make our lives easier with, as Joanna put it, our political lords and masters. I quoted. At least as Mandalore I was my own political lord and master, Though once I was back home I wondered how much flack I would get for my prolonged absence despite all the honor and glory and battle I covered myself with ever since leaving to deal with Crimson. There were going to be some political complications and not just the old-fashioned and straightforward Mandalorian kind. Returning to the Republic proper and whatever Obi-Wan and Satine made of it was going to be another headache the folks here on Eriadu did by our version of events about Kamino. Getting away with it in the core was going to be more interesting. The same was true about Eriadu, I was sure of that. That's actually a good point. Gideon eventually relented, but only after he finished another glass. So, Joanna asked. I nodded. Preferably before we got drunk enough to make it one for the history books as an example on how not to write an R. =RK equals. Part 2. =RK equals. Officer Quarters. Eriadu Cruiser Peerless. Eriadu. Came morning, we were back at the same table nursing cups of steaming hot CF. Someone had cleaned the mess we left last night, because I clearly remember that there were more than a few empty bottles lying around when we finally crawled into our respectable beds. What greeted us was quite different. CF and breakfast awaited us along with the data pads we used to get the R done. Gideon did have an efficient staff it seemed, though there was the nagging question of security concerns percolating in the back of my head. Just in case I used the Force to examine my cup and couldn't find anything out of order. Meanwhile, my bleary-eyed companions were busy drinking CF as if their lives depended on it. Well, not feeling like dying from hangover did. My train of thought derailed moments after I laid my eyes on the supposed R in my hands. I scrolled down a few pages, took a sip of my own cup. It was scalding hot and strong enough to raise the dead, proper Navy CF that was, and only then did I turn my attention to Joanna and Gideon. They were beginning to stir and appear a bit less like shambling zombies. You know, this isn't how I remember the battle. I waved the datapad for emphasis. Fearlessly throwing ourselves at the enemy to protect Eriadu against genocidal droid legions. I read from the complete and utter fiction we somehow committed into writing. Gideon raised a finger and moaned. I remember leading our right flank into glorious counterattack that kinda saved your ass. That's one way to put it, I guess. There's another? Joanna arose from the dead two to ask quietly. Sucking in the bulk of the Separatists' battleships in a nice kill zone while playing bait. Besides, I wasn't too keen on having another ship get kamikazed from under my feet, so it was a nice thing there was a way to ensure that discretion was the better part of valor and still use my battlegroup's retreat to cruff over the machines coming to kill me. I thought that you just didn't want to get rammed. Again. Couldn't you have done the same with my freedom? That too. You did notice that the enemy was too keen on erasing me from the face of the galaxy to pay much attention to your own commands. Besides those munificents at the start, no one tried to ram you, did they? That was just to clear up some space so the rest of the Separatists could get to me with less interference. Now can someone tell me why I see we're claiming we blew up twice as many battleships as they brought in the first place? Gideon mumbled something. What was that? I can swear you just said you were drunk enough you saw double when you tried to remember how many ships we killed yesterday. I leveled an incredulous stare at Tarkin. Why are you so chipper anyway? You drank as much as both of us combined. Joanna groaned. Speak more quietly too, she added with a pained expression. The Force, duh. I got rid of my hangover as soon as I awoke. Bastard, Joanna accused, while Gideon just moaned piteously and drained his CF in a futile attempt to chase off the hangover. Please tell me that your men are trustworthy enough not to have taken a copy of this exercise of science fiction and posted it on the holonet. I waved the R. We've got to make it somewhat plausible before presenting it up for scrutiny, you know. It's plausible. Joanna frowned. I think. Really? The only bomber strikes I remember were to silence those two crippled battleships in the end after their umbrella got crippled from battle damage. We certainly didn't send any small craft wings to have their way with those sorry excuses for battleships, end quote. The hell did I just read? I don't remember reading anything like that. Joanna shook her head and winced at the motion. We used bombers yesterday? Gideon gave me a confused look. Did we actually write this tripe or are we being trolled by you staff? =RK equals. Observation deck. Republic cruiser shining light. Eriadu. I made my way to one of the tables in the repurposed former bridge of my new flagship while thinking about last night's shenanigans. In the end we had to redo the art to give it at least a veneer of plausibility that would pass a smell test once someone decided to compare what we wrote with the sensor records of the battle. We did make it look like that it was all a carefully planned trap meant to eliminate the last large concentration of Separatists' ships in the region besides the armada they were presumably throwing right now. Once that was done, Gideon got himself presentable and headed for the surface to present it in person. My presence was politely declined as redundant given the circumstances. I got the hint that it might be for the best that I leave for Naboo and then the core ASAP. Letting the local worthies calm down by making myself scarce would hopefully be enough to not complicate our alliance further. I let those thoughts go away and buried myself in the stack of reports prepared by Joanna's staff. On the bright side, so far Tarkin's people were actually abiding to the terms of our alliance and providing the fleet with what at least looked like maximum support. With the help of the locals we were going to have a not insignificant amount of battle damage more or less fixed on schedule and the ships rearmed and restocked by the time we intended to leave for Naboo. Everyone carefully avoided mentioning that all that was only possible because we lost a significant number of ships at Sullust and then yesterday. At least half of the supplies as well as a lot of the parts came from damaged ships that were deemed either too wrecked to repair or outright write-offs due to battle damage. We also had salvage parties crawling all over the Sys-Rex purging them from droids and stealing everything of use. Preliminary reports even claimed that eventually Gideon might actually get to play with a couple of fully operational Lucree hulks rebuilt from the combined wreckage left by the battles across Eriadu since the war began. My conservative read of the situation was that we lost at least a third of the fleet I extracted from Kamino, perhaps more depending on what happened with the other parts of the operation to purge this part of the mid-rim from Sys naval assets. My best guess was that barring a disaster the raids were somewhat successful before being forced to retreat to Naboo while the Separatists threw everything they had at them, not unlike what happened here yesterday. My fear was that it could be all over there before we were ready to leave, which could either mean that I would have a lot of enemy ships waiting for me or if Tarkin the Elder and Company won, they would have lost too many of our assets to achieve it. Ideally, when we got there we could take the Separatists from behind and achieve another nice victory. Of course, the worst-case scenario, that the Sys decided to rid themselves of the thorn in their side that was myself and the Mid-Rim Alliance and actually committed the necessary assets from other theaters of operation, well that didn't bear thinking about. We were so criff then it wasn't even funny. If that happened, there wasn't much I could do besides fleeing for friendly space and hoping to break to the eastern part of the galaxy without being trapped and wiped out. That's why once I got over the reports demanding my attention I would be busying myself planning our exodus back to Republic space. One way or another we would be heading there after going to Naboo. There were my few new minions too, who I had to get back under my watchful eyes before they got any ideas and made my life harder than it had to be. Strictly speaking, after hitting Naboo, we were going to have three options. First, head straight for Hutt space. That had the benefit of striking through territory captured by the Sys during their latest offensives and thus unlikely to be fortified. It would also mean we would have to travel longer, though once we reached Tatooine we would have more than a few decent options, including trying a high-risk run at a few systems that were supposed to be staging grounds for GAR assets just like Naboo was. Manda, Rishi and perhaps even Botha Oi. The latter we could reach even if we took the second potential road, which took us deep in Sys space. There was sheer audacity going for that option and the potential opportunity to hit at least a few soft targets before the enemy knew what hit them. However, going there would take us through no less than 5 major separatist systems with who knew what defense forces waiting there, until we got to Nexus Ortai and could either head for Botha or Lanos before hitting Hutt space again. The third option was a mixed bag. It would require hitting only 2 proper separatists' planets before we could either swing back to Hutt space. The reason why all roads lead to the Slug's domain was simple. Unless we took a detour through there we would have to fight our way through at least 5 to 10 additional separatist worlds before getting to friendly territory. I personally was torn between options 1 and 2. They should mean lesser enemy resistance and the potential of linking up with additional friendly forces if Botha or Lanos still held. Then we would swing through Hutt space again and hit Rondon, which would take us a single hyperspace jump from Kashyyyk. From there, if we were lucky we would be just a jump or 2 from friendly lines, not to mention that there was supposed to be a significant naval and ground detachments holding the Wookiees' homeworld and thus complicating the Sys logistics in the east. I had about a day or so to make up my mind and run my ideas through Gideon and Joanna for second opinion before leaving for Naboo. Now I had to figure out the logistics of reaching friendly space, especially if we had to make a run for it.